You are listening to Humanities Engaged, where we take a closer look at the value of a liberal arts education. I'm Steve McFarland, and I teach philosophy in the Division of Humanities at the University of Minnesota Morris. I'm joined by UMM student and brains of the operation, Adam Kretz. Say hi, Adam.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you for listening. You'll hear me chime in occasionally during the interview with a couple questions, and I'll join Steve afterwards to discuss what we learned.
We are coming to you from the University of Minnesota Morris, made possible with funding from the Mellon Foundation. Please join us as we interview UMM faculty to learn how they teach and why they teach.
Today's guest is Dr. Pierranna Garavaso. She is a member of the philosophy department in the Division of the Humanities. Dr. Garavaso received her Ph.D. from the University of Nebraska. She has won the Alumni Association Teaching Award and the Horace T. Morse Teaching Award. She is the editor of the recent book, The Bloomsbury Companion to Analytic Feminism. Dr. Garavaso often teaches Introduction to Symbolic Logic and Theory of Knowledge.
Do you have a story or a particular teacher? How did you get into your field of philosophy?
So I grew up in Italy, and so in high school we studied philosophy in the last 3 years of high school. And
everybody does.
Yes.
Is that the idea?
Well, not everybody wants to go to what is called a scientific lyceum or a high school and a classical high school. I went to the classical high school, which used to be the school that opened up all the possibilities, all the college directions. Anyway, I had a horrible teacher. He had written down stupid anecdotes, and that's what he read from his notes for 3 years. So I didn't understand anything in philosophy from him, but I did read it on my own, mostly existentialism, Sartre, Camus, a lot of continental stuff. So when I had to go to college, I had to choose, and my first choices were physics and law. And I couldn't do either one of them because my family wasn't rich, and to do those, I needed to live in a different city, so I couldn't afford it. So I had to do humanities, and so I thought about doing literature, but I really never felt like I could talk about literature, or it didn't grab me as much. So I decided to do philosophy, just hoping that it was what I was reading rather than what this guy had taught me. And fortunately, it was true. Philosophy was what I was reading and not what I heard in high school. So that's how I started.
Yeah, so then you started reading on your own. And how did you get into your specific area now of language, philosophy of language, analytic feminism?
That was a very long story, and I always tell people whether they want to hear the Cinderella story or so. I finished a BA in philosophy in Italy, then I started working on 2, let's call them masters, and one was in philosophy, and the other one was beginning in philosophy of science. I found philosophy of science very interesting, but it was not the dominant area in Padova. Actually, there were a lot of Thomists. People study Aquinas and religion, and then there were Hegelians.
Oh, gosh.
And yes, oh gosh is the right reaction.
I meant I didn't mean it that way.
In part, at least, it was the right reaction. I wasn't sure I could work or write on that. So I wrote my thesis for my BA on Wittgenstein because it was more interested in language. Yeah. And so then I started being interested in that. Then I applied for a PhD program in this country, and then when I came in this country, nobody studied Aquinas or Hegel in the department in which I went to. And I continue working on Wittgenstein, mostly in philosophy of math and in philosophy of language. So that's how I got into it. But it was a long, long story. It didn't start there.
So it's just kind of a drawn-out process, and
yes,
now you're here. So then what are 1 or 2 interesting questions that you're either your field or you in particular are working on day to day? What are some of the things that you're interested in?
So one of the areas in which I was most interested was still the philosophy of math when I wrote my dissertation. It may seem very technical and abstract, but actually what bothered me was this whole idea that, the truth of mathematics are representation of the properties of abstract entities that we can never perceive. So I didn't like that. So I tried to figure out a view in which it was more reasonable to believe that we accept mathematics for a much more pragmatic view or pragmatic approach. And so the whole idea that mathematical truths are rules, just like Wittgenstein thought, was very appealing to me. So all my years of the dissertation, and I would say 20 years after, I kept working on that and trying to criticize realist interpretation of mathematics. I just never believed in the existence of all these abstract entities. But while I was doing that, when you work in a small department like here in Morris, you had to teach a lot of different topics. So I started teaching metaphysics, philosophy of language, epistemology, philosophy of religion. So I started getting interested in other issues. And in particular, because I was teaching epistemology and there was this incredible field of feminist epistemology.
Which just very quickly, epistemology means what for people who aren't
Theory of knowledge, right, you're right. It's a fancy word to say that we talk about, why do we know, what do we know, how do we know, why do we believe the things we believe, how do we justify our beliefs. I'm teaching theory of knowledge this semester, and it's amazing to me how still timely and important it is. I have a very lively class, and I'm really enjoying the discussions. So I started getting interested in feminist literature. I found out it was extremely difficult, and so I included some in my courses. One of the areas in which I think it became very interesting was the issue of identity, right? And we teach personal identity metaphysics, and so that was another class where I started introducing reading from feminist literature having to do with what defines us in terms of, human beings or rational beings. All the literature on women in the history of philosophy says, many very good philosophers say that women are not rational, right? They're close to nature. They're close to passions. So they're not, and so all of these things intrigued me. And so I started reading more and more of this literature. Right now, I'm hoping to work on personal identity again in two ways. One is because there's split between the psychological criterion that says, we are a psychological being, that's our essence, and more animalistic, it's called, that's a terrible name, the biological criteria, which says that we are organisms. That seems to me to be very interesting, and I would like to figure out the way that both sides get the good that they represent. And then the last thing I want to mention is that it seems to me that in all of this debate, there's a lot of confusion between the notion of person, the notion of rational being, and the notion of a human being. So I think I would like to look at the literature and try to figure out if there is this confusion. I think there is, and maybe try to help by giving a little bit of a conceptual analysis of those three terms and their relationships.
And speaking of those, you're teaching classes in the spring that are going to deal with some of these concepts, correct?
Yes. I'm going to teach a class that one of my very dear advisees yesterday told me it's a terrible title. Nobody is going to take this class. And the title of it is Analytic Feminism, which is really a good descriptive term for the type of feminism we study, but she said, this is going to make people think you're going to use a lot of numbers. Nobody's going to take it. So what we actually do is to, look at concepts and look at arguments. That's, in a nutshell, pretty much a description of an analytic approach to philosophy. But we are going to do it discussing topics like, the balance between work and family, the notion of gender, pornography, abortion, issues in language having to do with gender. So these are pretty much the topics. And it's a beautiful book. The students who use this book, it's a volume by, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's entitled Feminism, Issues and Argument. It's written by Jennifer Soul, who teaches at Sheffield. And it's so good that my students say, not only I read the book, but I bring it home and ask my mother to read it, and she loves it. So I think it's a good book.
It's a good endorsement.
That's one class. Yeah, I think so. The other one is the Advanced Seminar in Epistemology and Metaphysics. And there, I think I have a narrative for that course. We'll start from thought experiments and look at how they are important in philosophy and in science. Then we are going to talk about intuition and their use in philosophy. Then we are going to talk about personal identity, the biological and the psychological criterion. We're looking at narrative as an account of identity, and then I'm going to finish with small sections having to do with rational being and human being and person. So pretty much what I mentioned before.
Yeah. So then when you're thinking about teaching, and you have a narrative for your class you just mentioned, how do you think about the progression you want the class to go through, what kind of assignments to give, or when you're setting up a class, what are your goals for the class? Because in my experience, students, they come to one class and they come to the next class, and they sometimes just don't haven't connected the dots for why we're doing this now rather than later or earlier.
Right. I think when I started teaching, I was in many ways deluded that my narrative was so obvious to the students that they would all get it. And of course it did not happen. And often students would write in their evaluation, and I'm very thankful for that they couldn't see the connections. So I decided that maybe this play in trying to make things hidden, and then the satisfaction of saying they discover all by themselves was, not very efficient.
So just to clarify, so you're saying there was, the way you used to set up courses, there was a message that they were supposed to be gotten, but it's better if they got it by themselves. But
it doesn't happen.
The hard part was it was happening too infrequently or something.
Yeah, it doesn't happen frequently enough. Plus, maybe it's, it's delusional to think that it would have happened because we're all different. Mm-hmm. And as faculty, we have our own narrative, our own, love for certain readings, and that's why we choose them. And so anyway, with the years I've become more explicit. I just tell them what my story is, why I connect them, and I try to create an atmosphere in class, if I can, in which they feel free nonetheless to tell me at the end or during the course, look, this one doesn't fit in, and it just, it never clicked for me. Yeah. And for me, that's very important. But I think I'm much more upfront with them about why I teach what I teach and what I'm hoping to get out of our, being together.
And do your course assignments and exam structure and all that, how does that figure into that picture?
Right. So for me, one of the assignments that is my class in Theory of Knowledge has to finish the paper this week, and it's due Friday. Mm-hmm. One of the skills that I really like them to get from all my classes is this ability to look at a passage, recognize that there is an argument, extract it using the words of the author, state it in a valid form if possible, and then explain in your own words what this argument is trying to prove, and then just total freedom in evaluating and focusing the evaluations on the premises. So that's one of the assignments, and I find it can be done at so many different levels. It can be done at a very elementary level, like I do in logic, or it can be at a very complicated level in the 4,000 level courses. And I know it's a little bit rigid, and many students don't take me seriously, right, because they've been taught writing in other classes, so they spend a lot of time one page on an introduction that I don't need.
Right.
You know, introductions like this, the problem of personal identity has been interesting for millions of people. I don't need that stuff. And so I kind of counter teach them how to do this. And then I say, after you really command this, then you can write just about anything you want. So that's a typical assignment. Then in the upper level courses, I like to give take-home exams because I want them to go back to the reading and rework on them. I tell them honestly that my class is not one in which they're going to learn a lot of notions or dates or data or theories, but it's more like a skill. I always tell them that both logic or any upper level course, I think, in philosophy is an exercise and practice in being able to support your views.
So you mentioned that the writing styles, you work on the writing style. And I have a lot of sympathy for students on this, because in some classes they learn they should write like this. And in some classes they learn they should write like that. And then in some classes they're not taught what the expectations are for this discipline or this, area of study or something like that. So I agree. So I always say, look, you don't have to catch me with a hooky, a flashy introduction. I think this topic's already interesting. And if you are in philosophy, a lot of times stating your thesis, your conclusion, is already controversial and interesting, usually, depending on what the topics are. So, but I think it's hard for the students because they're not always given those kinds of instructions. They're trying to do what they've learned. So do you give them? Sounds like you work on them. What are the expectations in a class like yours for writing?
Right. I try to be, as I said, very open and very transparent. And I don't want to sound disparaging, though, of, for example, the instructions they get in English or they get in other disciplines. So I just say...
It's different purposes.
Correct.
Yeah.
These are my instructions.
Yeah.
This is what I want you to do.
Yeah.
I found that now giving examples. So in this volume I just edited, I have a 20-page kind of primer in logic that takes out the most fundamental things that I want students to know in every class. And normally, in Analytic Feminism, I spend the first 2 classes to do this. And so in that article, let's say, I give 2 examples of 2 papers that would be typical for one of my intro classes, not the most advanced. But so I give them a quote, I extract the argument, I do all the explanation.
The same things you're asking of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I find that has been helpful in recent years. Before, I just spent a lot of time describing. So.
And how do you view your work figuring into the liberal arts at a liberal arts school like UMM?
Yeah, well, it's hard not to think that philosophy is a liberal art.
Yeah.
So I never felt, concerned about that. I just thought that teaching students how to argue and how to define the terms they use and giving them good intellectual habits would really be fulfilling the liberal arts mission. I also think that you say we don't have liberal arts in Italy. So when I mean it.
Yeah.
So when I came here, it was a reversal. I mean, when I lived in Europe, I tried to defend as much as I could science because people kept talking about, the classics and the canon, and science was not considered, opening the mind. And now then I come here where, of course, there is all this attack on the humanities. And that seems the reversal of what was happening there. So I tend to think that clearly both sides need each other. And I think what I teach fits with the liberal arts very well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think in order to defend the humanities, I have to disregard the work that scientists do.
Yeah.
I just
I
think
agree.
we need to do all and to
Yeah.
look at all.
Do you have a way that you put that? Why do the sciences need the humanities? After all, our podcast is called Humanities Engaged.
Oh, why the science? Well, for one thing, I take seriously my colleague scientists who say they need us.
Yeah.
Many, many years ago, we used to teach a first-year course that was called Inquiry, that was very controversial and debated. But one of the things that always struck me was that our colleagues in the sciences were exhilarated and excited about teaching a novel. And, some of the humanities colleagues were pretty, they were saying, well, a chemist cannot teach a novel. But that was exactly what, in my view, was, how can I say, a too partial way. Of course, as a humanities scholar, you can teach that novel in a very different way. But I think for the student to see a chemist getting extremely excited about Toni Morrison's Bluest Eyes was perfect. To, to prepare the student to know that when they grow up or when they get out of school, they should be able to appreciate all of these different levels. And cooperation is very important. I don't know, from the science we learn, for example, that knowledge is a social activity. And that is what we discuss in theory of knowledge. And I think science is our best example of a cooperative activity. Maybe writing a poem is not exactly the same thing. So I'm very happy to work in a place like this because it allows me all this cross, fertilization of ideas that I think it's very important.
What advice, if there was a student who came to you and said, I really want to do well this semester, particularly well, as best as I can, what's a piece of advice or two that you'd have for this student about how to do especially well?
Well, maybe, again, it's my delusion here, but the first thing I say to students is to take advantage of the one-on-one instruction they can get here. I don't think, and maybe there could be some faculty who are not like that at UMM, but I can't think of any. If I look at a list of all my colleagues, we are here because we like to work with students. And working with students one-on-one is really exhilarating. It's always exciting to get to know them. It's exciting when they make mistakes and you can help them. It's exciting when they come and they tell you, I thought this and you never thought of that. And so I would recommend that they go and get to know their faculty and that, they work with the faculty. Sometimes students say, well, I'm doing well in this class, so I don't need to get to know the faculty. And that's really sad because I say, of course, those that who do not do very well sometimes know they have to go and talk with the faculty. Unfortunately, not all of them do, but some do. But the ones who do well, they need to go and talk with the faculty about possible research opportunities later on that topic. They can talk about how they can improve their writing and continue working on it topic even when the class is finished. So those normally are that's normally my advice. Try to get to know the faculty, go to their office hour, ask questions individually, not necessarily in the class.
Yeah.
But my office hours are still very lonely. So I go to class and I start complaining. And I say, oh, my office hour was so lonely today. And they laugh, and sometimes they come.
Yeah. And what do you mean by opportunities to work one-on-one?
Well, the first one, as I said, the first opportunity is to go to office hour and so on. Then there are infinite possibilities. You can, like this week, 3 students from my class started working on their paper, and they sent it to me electronically and sent back comments. One of them was very excited. The other 2 were pretty happy, but one was really excited by the comments. I know his paper will be better. And I know also that, he got more interested in that topic. And then one-on-one, you can start talking about Europe's, right? You can say, look, you really wrote a good paper on this topic, so why not try to do more research on it? Or you can say, why don't you rework on this for the undergraduate research symposium in the spring? Or we are so lucky we had the Minnesota Society that has undergraduate presenting their papers, so we can encourage them to rework on the paper and present. And I think all of that requires a little more one-on-one. And then I tell students you should start thinking about a map, right? Or
meaning what? For
the Morris Academic Partnership, because in the spring, faculty are scouting for good students, and if you did a good work in this class, and if I know you personally, then I know you might be a good partner for me for research. It's much harder to approach a student that you don't know and say, would you work for me and with me? But if you know the students and their interests fit a little bit with your project, or you just know they want to go to graduate school, or they just like writing, those are all opportunity for one-on-one. In the intro to my, in the acknowledgement of this last volume, I think I mentioned, which was really somebody, 4 or 5 MAP student, Morris Academic Partners, which means my book took 4 years to be done, which is horrible. However, I got to know all of those students, and they all work on it. So.
What's a substantive or content type idea that you're hoping students take away from classes or particular class? Is there an important theory or idea or definition or something you're hoping that they remember?
This is a very tough question for me. And I think that shows I'm maybe a wishy-washy person. I had many colleagues over the years who had a big plan to build their own theory. So, Eshaji was here for 11 years. He had a very strong view on free will. And it's interesting to see how students who were working with him ended up gravitating in his area and taking his views. Now, I don't know. It's very hard for me. I think what I can teach most of the time, and what I can teach well, is an approach to philosophy. It's a methodology. I have very few areas in which I feel like I have a solid, or at least a position that I really have a hard time leaving. So maybe in personal identity is one of the few areas, but I tend not to transfer that to the students. I'm happy even if they are a great supporter of the psychological criterion, where people identify with their memories and personality and stuff. I really think that's a wrong view on personal identity. But what can I say? It's okay for me.
Yeah. Well, that's like a position, but do you hope that they understand the difference between a
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is true. I do want them to be able to recognize the difference between being a realist and being a non-realist in philosophy of math, or being, a supporter of psychological criteria or a supporter of the biological criteria. Yes, I do want that. But most of the time, the content is not the alliance with one theory.
Yeah.
So I couldn't tell, whether it's better if they are Kantians or utilitarians.
In ethics.
Yes, in ethics.
Okay, and then you mentioned you care more about methodology. So what should they take away from your classes in terms of methodology?
They need to take away what I call C, which is state, explain, and evaluate arguments. And
SEE.
SEE, exactly. So that's really is the main thing that I like them to take away, and that ability to, define their concepts, be able to recognize the bare bone and the structure, the skeleton of an argument, and be able to focus their criticism on specific topic. See, in the evaluation, I'm so picky that I tell them that their discussion has to be focused on the truth or falsehood of the premises. Often students learn the first two steps. They state the argument and they explain it in their own words, and it's very difficult, I think, to explain an argument well. But then when they start their evaluation, they just, as I always say, walk away, because they're so used to writing more freely than what I require them to do. And so I tell them, I don't care about all of these comments unless you tell me that they are relevant to the truth or falsehood of those premises. How would we spend all this time to clarify the argument, to explain the argument rationale, and then walk away with a lot of comments that are not relatable to that? And so that's really what I work on a lot.
Yeah, I one time had a student who said, so philosophy is often argumentative, not necessarily shouting, although sometimes, but the style is persuasive. You're trying to persuade someone to either agree with this or disagree with this type of view. And I had a student one time who said in their final paper, they found that they were having a tough time exploring, that I wanted something different. And the truth was, that's true. I did not want them to explore in this paper. There's times when you should explore, and there's things that are like that. But in this final paper, it wasn't exploration. It was persuade, right? Persuasively. It's not a...
Yes. And I think that's hard for people to think about. I think, unfortunately, philosophy has a bad reputation in many ways. Like, people sitting around the table and shooting the breeze, and every opinion works. And it's not true. I mean, I'm willing to accept every opinion that is justified. That's the thing they don't, sometimes they don't understand. It's true that we accept every opinion, the devil's advocate and so on, but it has to be reasoned. It has to be given reasons for it. You have to consider objection. You have to reply to objection. It's very hard work. But it's also extremely stimulating intellectually. I had many students over the year telling me that after doing, a major, it was so hard to go to, for example, a different major or a graduate school where they had just to learn data instead of discussing. And they found that discussing different alternatives and try to figure out, objection and replies was intellectually very stimulating.
Yeah, I've had a lot of biology pre-med students who say, this class is my favorite class of the semester because it's the only one where I don't have to just sit and absorb.
Correct.
I get a chance to think.
Yes.
So then, do you have resources that we can learn more about the topics you're interested in? Preferably one that's more in-depth and one that's more accessible to a larger audience?
Okay, so for the accessible, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I tell every student they should spend the summer reading The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. I find him still so intriguing, and it's so easy to see where he's wrong. And so that gives students the confidence. that I can criticize, a master like Russell.
And anyone can pick up that book and
Yes,
get something out of
anybody.
it.
It's a classical book. It's probably on eBay. You find it for 99 cents because it's very old. It's 10 chapter, and the end is the final chapter is on the value of philosophy, and it has a very strange view on the self. And there is a lot of epistemology, of theory of knowledge, but also metaphysics at the beginning. So you really get a primer on, many of the philosophical questions. And then more in depth, I just finished working on it. I think it's a good book. It's called The Bloomsbury Companion to Analytic Feminism. And it's divided in 3 areas: metaphysics, epistemology, and value theory. And all the introductions are meant to those 3 different areas, are meant to be, accessible and easy. The articles are a different level of difficulty, but some of them are extremely intriguing. I think one is about police brutality, and it's in the epistemology section. There are some that are on proxy for, proxy decision for the end of life. There are some that are whether there is anything before the social construction of our concept. So they are a different level of difficulty, but they are really interesting.
Yeah, and if you wanted to get more into depth on one of these topics, that would be a good.
Yes.
It's one volume that's good to learn more about a lot.
Right, and in every intersection there is an annotated bibliography for further reading. So it's a good resource.
Okay, well, we learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, that was a great interview with Dr. Garavaso. Adam, what did we learn today?
Well, yeah, I learned a lot about the importance, or at least, from her point of view of these office hours. I kind of saw a new way to look at that. She made this point about, once you actually go in there and talk to the professor, you get more interested in that topic. And I think sometimes in that lecture format that a traditional class follows in, the teacher's not speaking directly to you. And I think that does create a barrier to being interested in the topic. But when you're having a conversation with somebody, I think that by itself gets you more captivated in, just because you have to pay closer attention. And then I think maybe interest in the topic comes along for a ride because you can get a specific answer to a specific question that speaks to some specific curiosity you have, rather than just a kind of wider array of knowledge about whatever topic it is in class.
Yeah, absolutely. They can give you different references to look at, different resources to look at. Teachers know they're teaching to a range of an audience. Some students will be very interested, some who won't be interested, some with this amount of background, some with that amount of background. And you can't make a class perfectly targeted to each person at the same time. But if you are in a one-on-one interactions, then you can start to tailor things specifically to the individual you're talking to. And I sort of agree with Dr. Garavaso that as a generalization, not obviously not perfect correlation, but the students who are doing particularly poorly and the students who are doing particularly well are the ones that tend to come to office hours. So it's kind of interesting that many times the students who are doing very well already come in to talk about their paper. And I think there's a lesson to be had for if you are a B or C student, the A students are coming to class or coming to office hours, pretty frequently. And there might be something to that correlation. Yeah,
and then that gets us this, other point that I thought was interesting. Because if you have, and maybe you speak to this as a professor, you have a B or C student, and so we have this point about, it might make them more interested. But they say then in response, but I already have a B or a C. And And maybe I'll tie it in with this other thing that she mentioned, which is it's exhilarating for her to have these conversations.
Yeah.
And I think maybe a lot of students, it might be the case that they haven't experienced intense intellectual stimulation before. And certainly those office hours are a place to get it. And so I would want the B or C student to experience that if they haven't anymore. But yeah, would you have any other way to try to convince them to get involved, the B or C student? I mean, they're doing fine. They're getting their stuff done.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't want to convince everybody to, I want everyone to be interested in philosophy. I want everyone to be intellectually stimulated, but I don't think that you have to be interested in every topic ever to be a good citizen, a good person, get something out of college, right? If you get all B's in college, but you got something out of it that helps you, I think that's fine. But I do think you'll go down avenues that you didn't know were open to you intellectually, but if you care about we did an interview with Clement Liu on environmental justice. So if you care about activism, he might know people they can put you in touch with that can help you do better or have more effective activism or something like that too. So I don't think it has to be just intellectual stimulation to make it worth it. But I do think, it will increase your intellectual stimulation if you put effort into it, if you individualize it, if you take initiative, as you have many times, Adam.
I do like to go to office hours, everybody.
Thank you again to Dr. Pierranna Garavaso. You can find links to her book and to her recommendations on the podcast show notes. This has been Humanities Engaged.